July 2019. In the article I wrote for the July 2019 issue of this newsletter, I repeated the sixth item on my summary of the Old Testament message that I gave you in the April 2017 issue. 6. Because the sons of Israel failed to adhere to the requirements of both the first and second Mosaic covenants, the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel promised them God would offer a new covenant to the individual members of corporate Israel. He did that through the ministry of John the Baptist. But the new covenant that the Jews accepted at that time was just like the first old covenant their ancestors had accepted at Mount Sinai. It provided no means of atonement. If a person sinned, he would immediately be cut off from corporate Israel. So God cut off from corporate Israel all the members of corporate Israel other than Jesus Christ, because they could not keep the terms of the new covenant. I have also explained these things in Not All Israel is Israel. Then I reiterated the first thing that is absolutely essential to an accurate understanding of the things that Moses wrote with regard to God's legal agreement with the sons of Israel. God signed on to 3 covenants, legal agreements, with the sons of Israel. 1. The first legal agreement that God offered at Mount Sinai is described in Exodus chapter 21, verse 1, through chapter 31, verse 18. The terms of that legal agreement made all the sons of Israel one person, corporate Israel. That one person held title to every part of the promise that God handed down to Adam and Eve, when he banned them from the Garden of Eden. But God did not provide any means of atonement under the terms of that agreement. If one member of Israel sinned, every member of Israel was guilty of his sin. Therefore, when the sons of Israel broke the legal agreement by worshipping the golden calf that Aaron made, God rejected the entire group, except Moses. 2. The second legal agreement that God offered at Mount Sinai is described in Exodus chapter 32, verse 1 through chapter 40, verse 38. When Moses begged God to spare the sons of Israel and not destroy them, the Lord agreed to ratify a second legal agreement with the sons of Israel. But he did not make the second legal agreement directly with the sons of Israel, he made it with Moses. And he made Moses the sole member of corporate Israel with the sons of Israel grafted into corporate Israel as members of Moses. That is, Moses was in much the same position as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been when they were the heir of the promise. The only difference was, corporate Israel had already been established as the heir of the promise under the terms of the first legal agreement. Therefore, Moses became the sole member of that corporate body. Under the terms of the second legal agreement, God also allowed atonement for sin so that, although corporate Israel was still held guilty for the sin of each individual member, the individual members could retain their position in the corporate body by following the sacrificial rituals that Moses established. 3. The third legal agreement that God offered the sons of Israel is described in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 1 through chapter 32, verse 52. Shortly before Moses died, the Lord laid out the terms under which Moses, as the sole member of corporate Israel, would hand down the promise to the sons of Israel so that they individually became members of corporate Israel rather than members of Moses. Under the terms of that legal agreement, the most significant change was to the priesthood. The entire tribe of Levi replaced the sons of Aaron as priests, and they were given the responsibility of handing down the teaching of Moses from one generation to the next. I told you that you also need to understand the significance of several passages of Scripture before you can read and understand what the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel said about the new covenant. I said the basic takeaways from Leviticus chapter 26, the first passage essential to your accurate understanding of the message of the Scriptures, are fairly easy to understand. Then I gave you my translation of the chapter and pointed out a few things one should make note of in the text. 1. Every last statement in the passage is addressed to the sons of Israel as individuals. I have indicated that, by translating every plural form of the second-person personal pronoun, with a lowercase u, and bolding every occurrence of it. If the statements in the passage were addressed to corporate Israel, I would have translated the pronoun you, with an initial cap u, to indicate the statements are addressed to corporate Israel, instead of the sons of Israel as many individuals. 2. The promise stated in verses 11 and 12 is clearly conditioned on the people fulfilling the conditions on which the promise is based. You need to keep that in mind simply because the text of the scriptures make it abundantly clear that did not happen at any time during the Old Testament history of the sons of Israel. You also need to keep in mind the fact that the tabernacle was already in the midst of the sons of Israel at that time. The point being, the promise stated in verse 11 is not talking about God dwelling in the tabernacle among the sons of Israel at that time. It is, instead, speaking in terms of a time when the individual members of corporate Israel would finally get their act together and do what God required. 3. The promise stated in verses 44 and 45 explains what God intends to do after the sons of Israel have violated the terms of the legal agreement they accepted at Mount Sinai, thereby making that legal agreement null and void. At that time, God says He is going to go back to the terms He stipulated under the first legal agreement He offered the sons of Israel when He brought them out of Egypt. Make note of what I just told you. It is extremely important. That is because God did not offer any provision for atonement under the terms stipulated in the first legal agreement. Then I emphasize the two promises God made the sons of Israel through Moses in Leviticus chapter 26. Leviticus chapter 26, verses 11 and 12, my interim translation. Then I will put my residence in your midst and my soul will not detest you. And I will move about in your midst, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Leviticus chapter 26, verses 44 and 45, my interim translation. But by all means even after this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, and I will not detest them so as to finish them off, so as to make my legal agreement with them null and void, because I am His Majesty their God. But I will remember for them the legal agreement with the first ones, those that I brought out of the land of Egypt, in the sight of the Gentiles to become their God. I am His Majesty. Then I pointed out the fact that the first of those two promises is conditioned on the individual members of Moses, the only member of corporate Israel at the time, adhering to all of the terms stipulated in the legal agreement. The second promise is completely unconditional. God is going to do it no matter what. After I explained those things, I told you that you need to know what God said to the sons of Israel when the time came for Moses to hand down the promise before he died. I reminded you he did that by means of the blessing recorded in Deuteronomy chapter 33, and I gave you my interim translation of what Moses said. I told you that if you understand the significance of that blessing, you should be able to see the bigger picture within which it occurs. That is, God made Moses the heir of the promise, the sole member of corporate Israel, after He cut off all the other members of corporate Israel after they sinned at Mount Sinai. Then He grafted them back in by making them members of Moses' house. Since the promise would be lost if Moses did not hand it down to the next heir of the promise before he died, Moses did exactly what was required. He blessed corporate Israel and made him the heir of the promise. I then explained how, in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 1 through chapter 31, Verse 30. All the sons of Israel became members of corporate Israel instead of just members of Moses' house. I told you the takeaways from Deuteronomy chapter 27 are just as easy to understand as those from Leviticus chapter 26, provided you are willing to accept them. 1. The majority of the occurrences of the second-person personal pronoun in that passage are singular, you, rather than plural, you. When Moses uses the plural form, he is always addressing the people as individuals. When he uses the singular form, he is addressing them as a single individual, corporate Israel. 2. The point of the passage, which is to emphasize the responsibility of the individual as it pertains to the corporate body, is clearly stated in verse 26. Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 26, my interim translation. Whoever does not confirm the words of this teaching by acting in accordance with them is irrevocably cursed. And all the people must say, without doubt. 3. The essence of the passage is summed up in verses 9 and 10, where Moses and the Levites tell the sons of Israel the obligation they have taken on by becoming members of corporate Israel. I told you the emphasis on the obligation of the corporate body of all Israel continues on in the next chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 28. So with very few exceptions, the second-person personal pronouns are all singular, to indicate that the obligation for adherence to the terms of the legal agreement falls on the corporate body. I said that the truth concerning corporate Israel should be fairly obvious if one just stops to consider the implications of what is stated in verses 54 through 57, and verses 62 and 63. In those two passages, individual members of corporate Israel are depicted as members of a corporate body that Moses addresses as a single person. I also told you that, knowing Moses addresses the people as separate individuals should make it obvious that God had no confidence the people would ever respond to him with unity during their 40 years in the wilderness. I said the truth is, when God spoke through Moses and Aaron after the erection and consecration of the tabernacle, he was already planning to move on from the second legal agreement to yet a third legal agreement, the one in Deuteronomy. But the sad fact is, he was already planning to move on from this third legal agreement to a fourth legal agreement. That was because he already knew the people were not going to adhere to the terms of this third legal agreement either. I told you the essence of the legal agreement the sons of Israel accepted that day is laid out in Deuteronomy chapters 27 and 28, and then I showed you Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 14 and 15, which indicates the legal agreement would continue on from one generation to the next so as to include all the descendants of those who accepted the legal agreement the Lord offered at that time. Then I showed you Deuteronomy chapter 30, where Moses switches from speaking generally regarding what the future holds for the sons of Israel and begins to speak specifically concerning the future of corporate Israel. That is, he begins to speak prophetically. I said Moses consistently uses the singular form of the second-person personal pronoun in Deuteronomy chapter 30, because he is speaking in regard to the future of corporate Israel. But he is describing what will happen after Jesus Christ becomes corporate Israel and corporate Israel finally does what God requires. I said that is why Paul quotes Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 through 14, in Romans chapter 10, verses 6 through 8. Then I told you Moses goes on in Deuteronomy chapter 31, to describe the parabolic pantomime God orchestrated in which Moses, as the heir of the promise, had to die so that those he had previously blessed could parabolically inherit what was promised. I next showed you how God changed the terms of the Old Covenant each time he offered the sons of Israel a new covenant. 1. First Old Covenant creates corporate Israel. Corporate Israel is the heir of the promise. Individuals are members of corporate Israel. No atonement is provided for anyone. If one sins, all are guilty. Aaron and his sons are the priests. God will reside in the midst of his people. Agreement is null and void at God's discretion. 2. Second Old Covenant. Corporate Israel is retained. Moses is the only member of corporate Israel. Moses is the heir of the promise. Everyone else is a member of Moses' house. Atonement is provided for individuals. No atonement is provided for corporate Israel. If one sins, all are guilty. Aaron and his sons are the priests. God will walk in the midst of his people. Agreement is null and void at God's discretion. 3. Third Old Covenant. Corporate Israel is retained. Corporate Israel is the heir of the promise. Individuals are members of corporate Israel. Atonement is provided for individuals. No atonement is provided for corporate Israel. If one sins, all are guilty. The Levites are the priests. God's desire is to dwell in their midst. Agreement is null and void at God's discretion. I told you those are the basic differences between the three covenants that God made with the sons of Israel, but I also told you that if you ever intend to gain any insight at all into God's reason for ratifying those three legal agreements with the sons of Israel, you would do well to look at what he retained in each one, rather than focusing on the differences. I pointed out the following facts. 1. God continued to retain corporate Israel after he used the first legal agreement to create that corporation and make it the heir of the promise. 2. God never provided any means of atonement for corporate Israel. 3. The foundational motive driving God to continue dealing with a recalcitrant bunch of imbeciles was his desire to dwell in the midst of his own people. That is, he desired to have children, a house, that he could call his own. Then I told you that if you want to understand the message of the Scriptures, you have to start at the beginning and follow the story through the Scriptures, hopping from one passage to the next, wherever you find one text quoted in another. I said the truth will escape the notice of those who have not read and understood the things I have already explained with regard to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. I also told you the truth is, those two verses are describing what happened when Christ was resurrected, that is, when he was transformed into the image and likeness of God himself. I reminded you that, when God booted Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he gave them the promise that anyone could be made in the image and likeness of God, if they believed and held on to the promise until they died. That is, he promised them they could be resurrected as his children, full-fledged members of his house, his people. And I told you that if you start reading in Genesis chapter 5, and continue reading from there all the way through Genesis chapter 50, you can find every name on the long list of men who were, at one time or another, the heir of the promise. I said God used the three covenants that he ratified with the sons of Israel, to make sure corporate Israel became the heir of the promise, who had responsibility for handing the promise down to the next heir of the promise. That's where the new covenant fits into his plan regarding the fulfillment of the promise he made to Adam and Eve. It provided the mechanism whereby God could not only hand the promise down to the next generation, but also ensure there would never again be any need for a brainless bunch of deadheads to get their act together and do what God required. Then I showed you Exodus chapter 6, verses 2 through 8, where God declares he intends to take the sons of Israel to be his people. I said God's plan has always been to reside in the midst of his people. And I showed you that is the point he made in Exodus chapter 25, verses 8 and 9, and Exodus chapter 29, verse 45, when he told Moses to build a tabernacle just like the one he saw on Mount Sinai. But I also pointed out Exodus chapter 33, verses 1 through 3, where he changed his plans a bit after the sons of Israel sinned. I told you the change in God's plans is clearly reflected in Leviticus chapter 26, verses 11 and 12, since the promise in that passage is clearly contingent on every individual son of Israel doing what is required under the terms of the second legal agreement before God would be obligated to fulfill the promise. Since some folks prefer to believe otherwise, I merely point out again the fact that the tabernacle was already in the midst of the sons of Israel at that time, so the text has got to be speaking of a time yet to come. The truth is, that time has already come and gone, but in the wisdom of God, it continues on for the fortunate few who have experienced the phenomenal effects of the new birth that God promised through Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Those two prophets make it clear that you can't come to God, asking for forgiveness, and just work it up. By that I mean the new birth is not attained by intellectually accepting the truth of the gospel, whatever that means. It is only gained when your apology for sinning against the Lord is both honest and sincere. If it isn't, God won't accept it, and you won't receive a new heart, and a new spirit, so that you can be mentally transformed into his child. Jeremiah and Ezekiel make that point in the New Covenant passages I showed you, all of which are easily identified by their paraphrase of the promise recorded in Leviticus chapter 26, verses 11 and 12. I told you, I realize I am way ahead of my explanation in more ways than one. First of all, I am a Gentile. So how could I ever lay claim to a promise that was made to the sons of Israel? But I also told you I would cut that Gordian knot in the next issue of this newsletter. I said it is enough that you know why God changed the terms of the legal agreement he had made with corporate Israel, by offering its terms to every individual member of that corporate body. I said your understanding the truth depends on your knowing the significance of Ezekiel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. I told you Ezekiel explains what God had in mind, individual responsibility for sin. But I also said some dim light might claim Ezekiel was referring to what was already the case, that is, that every individual had to offer sacrifices for his own atonement. But that is not what the passage is talking about. The people were facing deportation to Babylon, and the prophets were telling them God was punishing corporate Israel for the sins of prior generations. In response, the people were using a nifty little saying to blame God for their sorry predicament, telling the prophets it was not right that they were expected to suffer for the sins of their fathers. So guess what? Jeremiah and Ezekiel responded by telling them it would not be that way under the terms of the new covenant. In Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 29 through 34, the prophet explains the case clearly, and the apostle Paul, the author of the book of Hebrews, quoted that passage in Hebrews chapter 8, verses 6 through 13, to make the claim that Jesus fulfilled the promise Jeremiah made. Those are a few of the things I have already explained. Now I am going to tell you even more things you need to know if you intend to avoid the delusion of the Antichrist.